And you're live.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our OpenJS Foundation live stream today. And I'm really delighted to have with me today Dave and Nick to join us for our chat. First, I hope that everyone is safe and healthy and staying appropriately social distancing. A couple of things that I do want to cover for logistics reasons. First, want to remind everyone of our code of conduct, and I'll be selecting appropriate questions from the prepared remarks and our submitted questions and from the live streams. Every couple of minutes, I'll be checking to see if any questions are coming in, and we'll turn to those. But I've prepared a whole set of questions. I think that we will have fun with this. Really delighted. So let's get to it. Nick, Dave, co-creators of the Node-RED project, maintainers, really delighted that you're here with us today. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves.
Well, thanks, John. So I'm Nick O'Leary, as you say, co-creator of Node-RED. I'm sure many who follow the Node-RED project on the forum or wherever it is will know Dave and I, and be aware of everything we do. But essentially, we're the guys behind the curtain who created Node-RED originally, 7 years ago now, and have been plugging away at it and working to build out the project that we have today.
And I'm Dave Conway-Jones. So pleased to see you all guys online. As Nick said, I've been created about 7 years ago. I'm now part of IBM Research, and we've been using this tool ever since for various things we've been building non-stop as we go along. So we keep extending it with your help. So yes, back to you, John.
So Nick, let's start off with a quick retrospective on the Node-RED history. Tell us what's been going on for the last 7 years.
What's been going on? I mean, briefly, Node-RED came about as a side project when Dave and I worked together in our emerging technologies group, wanting just to play around some technologies, wanting to create some tooling that just made our life easier doing our day job of creating Internet of Things type projects, but typically very quick turnaround, very experimental. Just don't want to spend huge amounts of time in deep code. You just want to try and build a solution, prove an idea, and move on type of idea. So yeah, it seems an obvious thing now, but at the time it was what would it mean to have some tooling that let you abstract away the lines of code you have to write. More than capable of writing that code, but the more time you spend writing boilerplate code is less time you're actually bringing value to whatever you're doing. So yeah, I think it was ultimately just looking for a way to make our lives easier and wanting to play around with new technologies. At the time, I wanted an excuse to do a bit of a deep dive into Node.js as a programming environment. So Node-RED is pretty much the first thing I built in Node.js. Also wanting to play around with browser visualizations and seeing what you could do. And all these streams kind of came together in my mind for what has turned into Node-RED.
Cool. Yeah, and I was working on some projects where I was actually out sitting in a cold field somewhere, trying to type code with cold fingers, and saying there's got to be a better way. So when Nick showed me the very first sort of prototype of this, I sort of grabbed it and said, yep, absolutely, I need that. And I went and started hacking away at it over the weekend and broke it all completely. At which point Nick then ripped it back out of my hands and said, let's do this properly. Let's build it into a tool that can be extended and be useful for other things.
Did you have particular use cases in mind in that early days when it was just coming together, or was it truly just a Node.js experiment?
So the original scenario was about MQTT messaging. So if you're familiar with MQTT, it's very lightweight publish and subscribe messaging. You subscribe or you listen to a topic and you publish messages to that topic. we have a long history in our group with MQTT and projects using it. So that, in fact, the very, very, very first version of the code before we had come up with a name even was primarily about mapping messages that get published to one MQTT topic to a different MQTT topic, maybe doing a bit of changing the message as it flowed between the two. And I think it was Dave sat in that field, knew he had to plug in I think a GPS or some sensor over a serial connection. So on like day 2, he was saying it's great, but now how do I get my serial data in? And that was when I then took it off him and went and worked out how we could make it a little bit more extensible. And the idea of having these pluggable nodes started really early on in the project. And so the second node that was created after, or the second set of nodes, was the serial nodes, and because Dave needed it in a project that day. And I think for the first month or so, every new bit of function that was added was because we had a project that needed some new bit of function, which was really good because it meant we stayed focused on actual requirements. We weren't imagining use cases. We had real use cases and real problems to solve, and that sort of sustained the requirements for the first leg of its existence.
I know we'll talk about it later, but one of the very early use cases was we did instrument up a production line in a factory with using Node-RED. So because they had a bunch of sensors that they wanted to make talk, and we could use it to put them together very quickly.
So you guys have mentioned that you worked in the emerging technologies department at IBM Herzli. And so you guys had a lot of latitude. What's it been like to work in the open, to work with open source, to collaborate with the community for the last couple of years?
So certainly in our mind, the goal was always that this needed to be an open source thing. Just the being personally long supporter of the open source way of developing, but also in the part of the organization we were, this was a side project. This was not an effort to build some big product. This was a tool that was useful to us and had immediate relevance, but we were not a group there to create new products as such. And we very quickly recognized the value, as much of value as there is in the core of Node-RED, the real value is in that palette of nodes. The nodes represent what you can do. And at the rate that we were having to spend time writing nodes ourselves, we kind of just knew instinctively the best way to expand the platform was to get other people writing the nodes for us. So as we went through the process and got the various approvals, as of course you have to do in sort of corporate environments to open source it, there was that was a speedy process. I mean, I've spoken about that before. I mean, people can find the talk I did at Monkey Gra a few years ago about that process. When we open sourced it, we very consciously removed any barrier we could imagine to other people creating nodes. And I think in many ways that has been one of the keys to the success the project has had and the popularity it's gained, is because people aren't constrained to the functionality that Dave and I, the core contributors, if you like, have time to write. So that it's been a huge benefit to the project.
So IoT devices really lend themselves to flow-based, event-driven programming techniques. What was the secret sauce that really let Node-RED become so popular in the IoT space?
Well, I think because that's the space we were using it. We were running it, as Dave said, on Raspberry Pis in factories, in fields, connected to all sorts of interesting sensors. It very much came from an Internet of Things philosophy of being event driven, because the sensor reads some data, you need to do something with it. And we very consciously, when we open sourced it, led the project under that sort of banner, that it's visual programming for the Internet of Things. And because again, you know, what, 6.5, 7 years ago when we actually open sourced it, you know, the Internet of Things as an idea and a concept was very much at its peak of hype. So you know, that helped get interest in the project, but also I think it just, a lot of individuals, the fact we're doing it on Raspberry Pi, the fact we're doing it on you know, being an open project, made it very accessible to a huge audience of individuals who, you know, they're not having to spend lots of money on specialist kit for this. You know, it's a Raspberry Pi, it's, you know, like $50, and you know, they're away with it type of thing. So a huge part of our individual developer community, if you like, are people doing interesting things in their homes, home automation. You know, it isn't, you're not tied to having to do sort of industrial automation type projects with it. It is very flexible.
Having said that, I think the other piece is because it does abstract away some of the boilerplate stuff like HTTPS and OAuth authentication and some of the other, you know, nitty-gritty things that people would have to write otherwise. It does open it up to more lower level programmers, you know, lower skilled programmers maybe, or people willing to learn, or education areas and whatever. So it widens out the base of who can actually grab hold of this technology and actually put it to use. So indeed, you know, an awful lot of people we are seeing these days are using it in places like industrial use cases and production lines and in home automation or whatever, where they've come from a, you know, they've got an engineering background and they've got a hardware background, they know how to bolt things together, build bits of kit and whatever, but may not have the actual programming skills to go and do some very low level pieces. And I think this actually allows them to actually get on the, you know, get on and build things and actually make things useful.
Mm.
So
and
IoT is really, so IoT being Node-RED's first playground, and we know that Node-RED has graduated to lots of other use cases. Can you tell us where else Node-RED has become popular?
So we've always seen it being used in any sort of event-driven application style. So whether that's you know, building microservices, REST APIs, you know, HTTP-driven workloads, that type of thing. I mean, it really doesn't need to be constrained to the IoT space, and that is, you know, as I say, we certainly started out under the IoT banner, but you know, over time, particularly over the last year, as we got to our 1.0 release, we've sort of backed away, if you like, from labeling it IoT as much and trying to broaden the labeling out to be more you know, event-driven apps. So you know, a space we saw it very early on, and again, one of the great things about this being an open source project is you quickly lose sight of what people are doing with it. You know, it's no longer your little thing that people keep updating you with what they're doing. So just out of the blue, we had some people contact us saying they were using it, that they were developing a mobile banking application, and they were using Node-RED as a development tool for the back end of this app. Now, they weren't using it for the production system, but as a development organization, they needed to be developing their mobile app in parallel to the back end. But that meant the two teams were constantly sort of blocking each other because one needed the other to make progress. Well, with Node-RED, the mobile app team managed to mock up the entire back-end APIs in a day, and then that gave them a test server that they could then focus on the mobile app and build their app against. And yeah, it wasn't a use case we'd ever considered.
Let's explore that for a minute, because there's quite a few people come to think of Node-RED as a prototyping tool, and because real programmers program in, you know, pick your favorite language, C, Java, C++, Rust, go down the list, assembler. And so how do you respond to that question where is it a prototyping tool, or can you use it in production?
So there's no doubt that, again, in the very early days, we did talk about it as it's great for that, you know, quick application development and prototyping. But and it's absolutely matured, stabilized, to be honest with you, very quickly. And there are tons of examples of people using it in production. We've got a huge list of companies who are using Node-RED in their own products or services, whether it's services they sell or products they sell, or they're using it internally, but that's still production because they're still supporting their internal users through some application developed in Node-RED. We certainly do see it being used in production, and often there's a case of you build your prototype, and if your prototype works and it's tested and it's solid, it's like, well, at what point does it stop being a prototype and it becomes actually this works? Mm-hmm. But you're right about the comment about the idea that you don't see the code. And I mean, this is true of low code programming as a general concept, not just with Node-RED. But it's all about levels of abstraction, and at what level of abstraction do you as a developer feel comfortable? Because you reeled off a long list of programming languages there. It's like, well, each programming language is just an abstraction on the next layer down. So with each abstraction, you are giving up some degree of control, some degree of seeing the individual lines of code. Now, admittedly, with something with low code programming like Node-RED, it's perhaps a bigger step because the abstraction is different, perhaps, than going from C to JavaScript or whatever it might be. But but the fact remains is, as a programmer, it does let you focus on the design of the logic of your application, and there's no harm in that.
And it suits different types of programmer as well, differently, because people learn in different ways, people think in different ways. Some people like drawing pictures and diagrams and flows of things. This connects to this and that connects to that, and drawing things on whiteboards. This kind of much more to that.
So that's an important, let's explore that for a minute, because popular right now are these low programming techniques and models, and Node-RED is an interesting halfway in between a low code programming technique. You still can write JavaScript if you need to with Node-RED, but so where do you see Node-RED fitting in the low code programming world?
So I think the reality is it still takes a bit of experience to get going with Node-RED. If you're an individual looking to download it and run it, because you need to install Node.js and you need to know how to then install Node-RED. So there is still a bunch of, frankly, command line things you have to do to get going with Node-RED. But you're quite right. Once you've got Node-RED going, you can do a lot with it without worrying about code, but it does give you the hooks to get in and write code if you need to. It does sort of hit that middle spot between completely isolating you from any line of code at all to forcing you to do everything in code. So there are plenty of low code alternatives out there. Lots are done as hosted services. So people often look at like if this then that as a very popular example. That's no code programming, where it's the service they offer is just to completely abstract out the code entirely. So yeah, Node-RED has this middle ground, and that's I think one of its strengths, in that it can sort of play across that wider audience. And to the point Dave made earlier, the fact that our audience can be a broad range of experience. You can have a domain expert, an engineer who knows far more about their domain than I do. They know how to solve the problems if they can break it up into the sort of the logical flow chart of steps. So Node-RED, the fact that Node-RED allows them to express that, they can look at a Node-RED flow and use their domain knowledge and their domain expertise to intuit what that's doing, and just helps them, rather than looking at a screen full of code. It is that level of abstraction that does make it more accessible.
Cool. So let's talk about 2020. Last year was a big year. Node-RED 1.0, you threw down the production gauntlet. And so where do you see Node-RED today, and what's coming next?
Well, so yep, we reached the big 1.0 milestone in, I think it was October last year. That was a major point for us to get to, a big sort of stake in the ground of, we've ticked off all the major items we had in our roadmap of saying, this is good. This is, absolutely something you can move forward with confidence in. That said, we aren't done by any means. There's a whole bunch of areas we want to expand on. One of the areas, particularly in production usage, that our story is weaker than it should be at the moment is around testing and how you can integrate testing into your Node-RED development experience. So we've got the start of some interesting conversations in the community around what is the Node-RED user experience for creating tests that sit alongside your main flows. So that's interesting. And then, we've always had these, there are so many different ways we could go. One of our perennial challenges is just trying to prioritize what we do. We don't have the resource we would like to be able to pursue every opportunity that's out there. So there's looking more at edge computing, for example, looking at how could you, one of the things I've spoken about before that motivates some of the prioritization I put forward is around this idea of being able to draw a flow in Node-RED that represents the logic from what runs on a device, maybe it runs on 10,000 devices, all the way through to the logic that runs in the cloud to manage the data coming from those devices. But thinking about it in terms of, an event happens on a device, what is the life cycle of that event all the way through to something happening on the server? So in Node-RED, being able to draw that end-to-end flow and being able to identify the different parts of the flow that they live in they don't all run in one place. What would it look like to then hit that deploy button and have that all broken up, packaged, and then pushed out to multiple places? That's been a high level concept I've talked about before, that, thinking about, what are the missing pieces in the project? What do we want to do? And more immediately, we've got the 1.1 release coming up pretty soon. So
what type of new features will be included in 1.1?
So 1.1's got the ability to group nodes in the workspace, and by which I mean, like you might be familiar in PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever it is, literally, select some nodes, group them. You can then move those nodes around as a single entity, but then the group can have a border, it can have a background, it can have a label. So you can start visually documenting your flows. That's what's in 1.1, but the longer term roadmap for the group feature is to then allow those groups to have properties. So again, that speaks back to that concept I just mentioned about deploying to different places. The group could then be the way to say, this group of nodes deploy to my devices, this group goes to my gateways, this group deploys to the cloud, for example. So there's grouping, there's some redesign work of the sidebar to help try and make it easier to manage. The bulk of our users that we talk to regularly on the forum are the Raspberry Pi user, and they use it at a Raspberry Pi scale. So they might have a dozen tabs in the editor, maybe they've got a few dozen nodes, but every now and then someone turns up and says, well, I've got about 200 tabs in my editor and I've got a few thousand nodes. And we sort of think, wow, that's a scale of usage that goes beyond the sort of day-to-day experience. So looking at, how can we try and make it easier to manage those large installations of Node-RED. And then there's a whole host of interesting bits and pieces that have sort of crept along. So we hope to have a beta of 1.1 in the next week or so. We've got a few more pull requests that just need tidying up and merging before we do that, but it's on its way.
Yeah,
So
I mean, one of the things I'd say is that a lot of the features that we get put in there are do come from the users in the community. They come back with great feedback all the time. Both at the high level features, oh, wouldn't it be great if we can do this, or down to the low level things like, hang on, I don't understand why this why this button does that. Don't you need better documentation? And all the way up and down the stack, we get good feedback from from users. So that is what drives day-to-day little tweaks and enhancements that make it better.
So there's a question about some of the new features or feature requests, and some people think horizontally in a flow, and some people think vertically in a more in a column set of techniques. Have you explored changing the way the nodes flow?
So this has been one of those sort of bubbling along in the background, shall we say. So the question's been asked before about why do our flows go horizontally rather than vertically. To be honest with you, that was I didn't make a conscious choice, if you like, when on day one of creating Node-RED. It just seemed to me to make sense to go from left to right, because that's just what felt natural at the time. But we know that there are lots of valid reasons why someone might want to draw their flows vertically, going top to bottom. So much so, we know there's some users in the Node-RED Japan user group who are a really active user group, and we get some really interesting stuff coming from them. They've actually provided, we now have a pull request that allows Node-RED to draw the flows vertically rather than horizontally. Some of the challenges around that, though, are now sort of going beyond just how do you draw them vertically rather than horizontally. It's challenges around the user experience of how does that mean we have to mix horizontal and vertical? If someone creates a flow that's vertically aligned and a horizontal editor imports it, what do we do? And so that so we've sort of got beyond the basic task of have we got the code to draw things vertically, and we have that code now. We're kind of at the point now, well, now we've got that, we've got to try and figure out how do we make that part of the Node-RED experience without compromising the Node-RED experience. So so that's not currently in the 1.1 plan. It's because it's, to be honest, a slightly, well, in my mind, lower priority based on conversations. But again, if people in the community feel strongly about that, we can bring it back. But just know that there's a bunch of user experience design still to be done to sort that out properly.
So there's another question here, Nick, about doing an encrypted Node-RED application where you would create a flow and then sort of package it into an app similar to an Electron standalone application that you would run on that native operating system, Windows, Linux, Mac. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts yet about that?
Well, so I think there are two slightly different ideas there around the packaging. So on the, I'll let Dave talk about the Electron side, but on the encrypted side, that's it's a hard problem to do right, because any sort of encryption, well, something's got to have a key that can decrypt it. There's, in terms of trying to create, well, at best you can do is obfuscation, but ultimately the code is going to be there that someone can examine it. I mean, you can decompile Java, you can, there's ways and means of inspecting code. So if it's a model that people are interested in, then of course we're open to discussing it. But I think there's enough hard problems to try and solve there that it's not something where we are actively pursuing. we know there's some interest around encrypting of subflows in Node-RED to allow subflows to become things that can be more easily shared between users, but perhaps you don't want to share the inner workings with the user because it might contain proprietary information. But again, having done a bit of design work around that, it's a hard problem to deal with the key management of how you encrypt, how do you decide who can decrypt it, and once one person can decrypt it, then anyone can get hold of that key and decrypt it potentially. So it's an interesting problem, but there's no easy answers.
Yeah, and as for the Electron side, again, that kind of splits into at least two versions as well. There's a thought about, do you just have a Node-RED Electron app where it's basically just the IDE for doing editing flows, and you pointed out a flow or you pointed at a different machine or whatever it is, and create basically a Node-RED editor. That's an Electron app, so that you just run an exe file and away you go. But then the other thought is, well, but you can also build things like dashboards. We might get onto dashboards later and things like that, which is actually your app with a front end on it. In which case you just don't want the editor piece; you just want the actual application running. And we already have. There's also there's a Electron Node-RED project out on GitHub that I run, which is got a basic skeleton for that. If people want to use that and try that. And that works in that mode, that you basically gives you a dashboard and you run your dashboard, but you don't expose the editor, or you can expose the editor if you want to.
Well, let's explore that for a minute, because in production, you really want to separate the editor from the runtime. And so just being able to run sort of headless Node-RED flows becomes a really important part of that 12-factor, make it repeatable and controlled. Do you see Node-RED scaling up in a production set of environments where you've got pretty heavy workloads? You don't really want to bring the editor along, you just want to bring the runtime forward.
Yeah, so we already have all the bits to do that today, and that is a pattern you can do. I think what's distinct about the Electron side is it's the user experience of how you install it. Frankly, it's a operating system native installer, whether you're on Mac, Linux, Windows. It feels like a native app that you're installing. So so in the case of you've created something that presents data on a Node-RED dashboard, or any other any of the other dashboard toolkits that are out there for Node-RED, if that dashboard is the application you want to distribute to users, then that Electron model is an interesting one. On the 12-factor side, absolutely, you want to have version control, you want to have repeatable builds. And I've gone blank on most of the other 12 factors, but they are there, they're well understood. And we have good patterns for how you do 12-factor with Node-RED without the editor, whether it's doing it with containers, whether it's doing, we've seen people doing interesting things around Kubernetes, around managing Node-RED applications. And again, that's a space I would like the Node-RED project to have more content on and more patterns within the project. But just in terms of where our resource and effort has so far been applied, that isn't something we've produced content around. But we know people in the community are doing it quite successfully.
So let's talk about some best practices there, because we all see people sharing flows in the forum, and some of them are giant hairball spaghetti of code, and I've through my evolution of becoming a Node-RED programmer, do you have any tips for the audience around writing good readable Node-RED flows and how to construct them, the types of techniques you might recommend?
I would suggest, the starting point is often just get a bit more familiar with the core set of nodes, the basic set of nodes, because there's a lot of functionality in those nodes that if you're coming from a coding background, you might instinctively just reach for the function node where you can write JavaScript. And then you risk ending up with, sort of an input node where the event comes in, then a function node with a few hundred lines of JavaScript, and then an output node. And you've kind of lost the benefit of low-code programming. That said, there are times when that is a absolutely valid and useful pattern, but there's a lot of a lot of basic building blocks in the palette that you can use, and a lot of functionality that you can rely on in those core nodes. Then it's looking at one of people talk about spaghetti code, code that's sprawling and just a real mess. One of the downsides of the visual programming like Node-RED is you literally draw spaghetti on the screen rather than metaphorically. So just thinking about how you lay out the flows, we have things like the link node that allow you to break a wire, and so you don't see the wire on screen, so that the flow can jump from one point to another. Just think about the visual presentation, and the group feature coming 1.1, I think will be quite useful for helping users document their flows and create clean code, as it were.
I'm definitely looking forward to the grouping feature. I do quite a bit of layout and thought about how I want to build the flow first, before I just dive into grabbing every node in a palette. So I've written some really big
tactical use of things like link nodes and subflows is also very, very handy to actually sort of clean up your page, by using link nodes to either link different tabs together, or just even on one page to just stop lots of wires going back across the page.
So in some of the larger apps that I've constructed, multiple flow tabs, link nodes, talking to backends, talking to devices, building web interfaces and dashboards. Do you have developers now coming and with really large production Node-RED applications and flows?
Yeah. I mean, we do see, or we hear tales of large flows, large installations. Often we get to hear about them because people are raising problems, not necessarily around things not working, but we get some great user feedback in terms of the usability. So a good example is the runtime. The Node-RED runtime is single tenant. It's running one set of flows. It's not a multi-user runtime, but it does allow you to have multiple editors connected to it at the same time, with people working on different, working on the flows at the same time. And if one user deploys changes, it notifies all the other users and interrupts them, and they have to merge the changes in there and then. So it's better than it used to be, because it used to be you could very easily overwrite someone's changes because you didn't know they had deployed an update. So that's good that we don't, that doesn't happen. The downside is it can be quite a disruptive experience when you have two people editing at the same time. So again, that's an area I would like us to improve and do some more sort of automatic merging and more real-time editing between multiple users. So like in Google Docs, where you can see people's edits at the same time, what would one of my many side projects that I've started but not done much on is, what is that? How would we work so that if two users have the editor open at the same time, they can see what the other person is doing, and it doesn't matter who hits deploy. It's less disruptive. So, but it's the user feedback. Dave and I use Node-RED in the way we use it. That's just two examples across many thousand different ways you could use Node-RED. So the best way to improve the user experience is to get that feedback to us. Let us know what works, what doesn't work, that type of thing.
So I wanted to turn the conversation to Node-RED node programmers. So my typical approach when I want to experiment with a new API is to poke it with an HTTP request node. I build a table, I build a chart, I drop some data on a map, I'm certain that Node-RED programmers do similar things. What would you say to a developer who's sort of at that cusp of, hey, I should really turn that API into a Node-RED node? Where would they go for guidance and help for that?
So it's an area where, well, as with so much, we want more documentation, we want more education material around how to do some of this stuff. When it comes to creating new nodes for the palette, there's again, one of the great things of having 2,500 third-party nodes published to the community is there are a lot of examples out there, lots of examples you can learn from, crib from. But I will fully acknowledge, our documentation covers a lot of the basics, but hasn't necessarily kept up with everything that is possible to do. So again, if people are looking for ways to get involved, if people are interested in helping out the Node-RED project, then and that they have some experience around doing this stuff, then documentation is always a very welcome way to help the community.
So how else do you think developers can contribute to the project in translations and design and forum questions and documentation? What can we be doing to help you guys?
All those above, yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly documentation, translations. We've only got like 2 translations or 3 translations at the moment. We are definitely not language experts, so yeah, anyone who wants to help do some of the translations, that'd be great. But obviously, we kind of need like more than one person per language, because we need someone to mark the homework. We can't sort of just take somebody's word for it without checking it. Yeah, nodes, obviously, improving nodes, feedback on nodes is always good. Indeed, there are some other projects out there. There's a node gen project we have, which actually helps generate nodes from function nodes. So if you've got a function node, you convert it into a real node if you want. And Nick also mentioned, the ability to take subflows and make those into nodes at some point in the future. So there's those sort of things that are around helping some of the developing. Some of the other bigger features that Nick's mentioned and things like that, we do need help with designing and discussing them as well, because some of these are great ideas that somebody's proposed, and there's a quick argument about, or quick discussion about it, then it all goes quiet, and then nothing happens. And so why isn't it happening? Because it needs a much bigger, in-depth discussion, and we need people to actually engage and help with those discussions. We need that extra feedback for some of these bigger topics, because we can't get it all right ourselves all the time. And if we sort of leave it and think about it, we'll just be sitting there thinking about it for a long time.
So you guys spend a lot of time in the forum, engaging with the community, and you've been working now in the open for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. Open is really an entire mindset. You guys have been creating code, and it's out there for critique and admiration. It's sometimes rough and tumble. Sometimes it's inspiring. How do you guys wade through the forum and the constant questions there? What's your experiences with open source?
It's a mixed bag. I think everyone who's been experiencing open source for some time is, one of the great things about having a large community and being an open community is you get people asking questions from all sorts of different backgrounds, experiences. They don't know us, we don't know them. There's certainly a skill to managing the community that you need to recognize whenever someone asks a question. You don't know who they are, you don't know what mood they're in, you don't know how much they know, and you can't assume anything about them. So it does take effort to work in the community and keep it a positive, healthy environment. I think based on feedback we have, we do a fairly good job in the Node-RED community to keep it a welcoming environment. There's a great group of people on the forum who now, it's gone from the case where Dave and I have to answer every question to, Dave and I chip in when there's something useful for us to chip in, but but the community really does get involved and support each other, which is really positive.
And indeed, they have skills way beyond that, as in many aspects as well, which is really good, really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I love to be engaged in the community, in the forums as well. There's a question that I wanted to bring up, just came through on the YouTube. It's about Node-RED on constrained devices, and that sort of leads into Edge. So Edge devices sort of, yes, they're constrained by memory and CPU. We want to be able to run Node-RED at the edge, but running in a constrained environment is sometimes tough. Have you guys done any modeling to show how to tweak Node-RED, how to tweak the flows so that it performs well on the edge?
To be honest, I spend quite a lot of time playing with things at the edge on the small devices, and the answer is only by trying it and things like that. We don't really do. Again, this goes back to some of the tooling that was talking about. We don't have some expertise in profiling and things like that. We do have an OpenWRT.
Love to see a memory profiler sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, we do have an OpenWRT build that's out there, so you can use OpenWRT. Somebody's mentioned, I think, in the question there. But we can. There are certain things. I mean, the key things to remember are most of these our messages are objects that are passed around through memory. So if you've got a small device with a small amount of memory, if you then hook up a video camera to it and start sending big JPEGs around, you will be filling up the memory with JPEGs until they get cleaned up by Node itself, Node.js itself. So some of it's down to the underlying Node.js, and can that run on the device? Is that supported on the device as well? Because I know certainly some of the smaller devices now, Node.js is now starting to abandon 32-bit for some of the older devices and things like that. So we are kind of sitting on top of Node.js. So
that's an interesting point in itself. So what we are also aware of, there are other JavaScript runtimes designed for small devices, sort of IoT.js, Esprino, a bunch of really interesting platforms. Now, the Node-RED runtime is designed for Node.js, unashamedly, so we can't just drop it onto one of those other runtimes. But I certainly think that there's an interesting project to be done around being able to, for a subset of nodes, being able to do code generation that targets one of those lighter weight JavaScript runtimes. So whether it's a cut down Node-RED runtime or it's actually doing code generation, I don't know. But we've long talked around that would be a really interesting idea. Get to the point where you can deploy a flow to a tiny device. You're not going to be able to do install arbitrary nodes. It would have to be a custom palette of nodes for that device that have been implemented for that device. But again, the programming model is there, and there's no reason why it couldn't be, the Node-RED user experience couldn't be extended to target other platforms.
So one step above those really constrained devices are the newer Raspberry Pi 4, the Jetson Nano. They're actually pretty substantial small board Linux computers. I want a question about Edge and maybe starting to drift towards doing AI inferencing and AI prediction. Do you see Node-RED plus AI becoming an important pattern in the future?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're certainly playing around with TensorFlow.js. I know there's some other colleagues of ours in that forum as well, and that is certainly gaining a lot of interest and traction. Again, though, some of it does need to run on top of the runtimes underneath, so we kind of rely on somebody who've already done the binaries for, in this case, TensorFlow, but also for things like, can you run optimizing Node.js on those devices? And quite a lot of the problem sometimes these days is their GPUs, and Node.js is single-threaded. So how do you take advantage of a GPU with Node.js? And that's kind of way beyond the scope of this project per se. when people have cracked it, we'll quite happily wrap it with a node and we'll put it in the palette.
I've seen some really interesting TensorFlow JS nodes starting to bubble up from the community, and it's going to be a fun ride to see where Edge and Node-RED can go together. But so the next thing about Edge is managing them with containerized workloads. So I really would love to hear your perspectives on containerization and where you think Node-RED with Kubernetes, with OpenShift, with operators could be going.
So from a abstract Node-RED perspective, we focus on being a Node.js application, and that being sort of the lowest common denominator of what Node-RED is. Then looking at, okay, well, how do you then take that application and how do you run it wherever you may choose to run it? So, yep, containerization is an important one. We do have our Docker images. We've kicked around ideas, but they are, at this stage, just ideas over a cup of coffee rather than anything in the actual backlog around what if in the Node-RED editor there was a build sidebar that gave you almost a one-click experience to building a custom Docker image from your flows, for example. Lots of interesting concepts there that, when you look at whether it's Kubernetes, whether it's OpenShift, whether it's even sort of serverless environments, whatever it might be, our project's focus is being a Node.js runtime that we can run, and this is what we say: we run wherever you can run Node.js. So we don't want to limit ourselves or the imagination in terms of the art of the possible. We talked a bit about the Electron stuff, creating a standalone installable version of Node-RED. Again, that would just be an alternative way of consuming Node-RED. It wouldn't replace what you can do today. We would still be in npm module that can be installed and run as a completely embedded runtime in a bigger Node.js application or whatever it might be. But the Electron wrapping would make it more consumable to a different class of user, perhaps someone who doesn't have internet access, so they can't run an npm install, but they can copy a zip file on a thumb drive to get a native installer that installs the application onto a disconnected device, for example. So yes, containerization is important when we have our Docker images, but in my mind, it's just one of the many different avenues of how we look to deliver Node-RED into different environments.
Great. So I wanted to ask Dave a question about Node-RED dashboards. There was a question from our submitted comments asking about refreshing Node-RED dashboard to adopt a more modern framework like React or Vue. Angular 1.0 sort of archaic at this point, but really amazing things are being done with Node-RED dashboard. We see some great nodes just in the last year, Node-RED, Node UI table and level and LED. There's lots of interesting things, but what's your thoughts on replacing the framework?
Yeah, okay. So to be honest, the dashboard was always like a side project. We adopted because it provided a great visualization. It was provided by some guy in the community who then actually had to go off and do some real work, and he couldn't maintain it for a while, so we adopted it. It's not the core of the project. The core of the project is obviously the main Node-RED. The dashboard is however, a first-class citizen, and we try and maintain it and enhance it, and by allowing other people to now add extra widgets to it, that should enhance it some more. But yeah, we internally don't have any desire to rewrite the whole thing again from scratch. We're quite happy to let other people do that. If someone else wants to propose a project or bring forward a project, there is a lower level project called UI Builder from Julian in the community. You've done a great job there providing, which is basically a bare bones framework, provides hooks into Node-RED and all the hooks you need to bring your own framework to Node-RED to build your own dashboard. So the other problem with dashboards is that they all start to look the same. So everyone's got their own opinion on which way it should look different. So, you know, we're not going to go and prejudge that and bring out a new dashboard anytime soon.
The other interesting point when we talk about modernizing frameworks, feedback we sometimes, or questions we sometimes get, you talk about the sorts of questions we get in the community. You know, we get the questions of when you're going to rewrite it in TypeScript, or when are you going to change the editor UI toolkit to be something more modern than jQuery and JavaScript. And it's like, well, in my mind, I purposely chose not to adopt any of the frameworks. You know, if 7 years ago we'd picked the latest Angular, we would have had to have expended a huge amount of resource between then and now, just keeping current with the toolkits as they've done however many major version bumps over time. So it does mean, you know, to create the Node UIs, yes, it's jQuery and JavaScript. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do a heck of a lot with it. Yes, so it means it's not the programming experience you get with like a Vue.js framework or React. But you know, it was a conscious choice to try and keep it relatively vanilla, so that we wouldn't be tied to upstream projects that decide to, you know, deprecate and do a major version that completely breaks previous things. So, but that said, you know, if people wanted to explore what would it mean to create a Node UI using React or whatever it might be, what would the Node-RED editor need to do to be able to support that? I think that would be a genuinely interesting project. But again, I'm to avoid getting too opinionated on toolkits, other than having the opinion that we don't want to be opinionated.
So we are coming close to our time. I've got 2 more questions here. And I wanted to very quickly, as I look down through the submitted questions, you guys got a couple of really nice love letters here, just thanking you and Dave for your work in the community and work on Node-RED. And I just want to reflect that I think many of us building really fun, amazing apps on top of your work. And I think that's a great testament to your commitment over many years. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you all for pushing us in the right direction.
And so what do you guys think about doing more of this discussion format and the Ask Me Anythings? Have you thought about doing a Node-RED conference someday, or a more regular Node-RED meetup? We're all working from home in this new virtual world, YouTube Live and Zoom sessions, and why not? What do you guys think about doing something on a more
yeah, well,
regular
absolutely.
basis?
So I mentioned the Node-RED Japan user group. You're very conscious of the time we have remaining. So the Node-RED Japan user group have been really active for a number of years now, and they do have regular meetups. And they last year held a conference in Tokyo, and they are currently planning a conference for fourth quarter this year. But obviously, you know, given the world situation, who knows whether that's going to be able to go ahead or not. I've always, I'd love to be able to do some sort of Node-RED event. Again, the fact we're kind of stuck to doing things virtually actually works in our favor. So yeah, you know, let's see what happens this year. Let's see what happens over the summer. It would be great to put together some sort of virtual event, but also do some more regular virtual meetups. You know, ways to talk in the community.
Great. Well, I think I want to wrap up here with a huge shout out and thank you, Nick. Thank you, Dave. I wanted to thank the community for joining us today, and continued conversations in the channels. Really delighted that the OpenJS Foundation brought us all together for this Ask Me Anything. And so, any last thoughts, and we'll close ourselves up.
Yeah, finally from me, if there's any questions we didn't get round to or whatever, please just join us on the Node-RED Slack channel or on the discourse forum. We'll be there. We're always there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you to everyone. Those who know us, who are long-standing members of the community, those who are joining this for the first time, trying to find out more about Node-RED. thank you to the community. It's the community that makes open source. And, yes, Dave and I spend our time writing code, but frankly, the code would be meaningless without the community behind it. So, thank you to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll close here.